All right, we'll go ahead and get started now. It looks like our attendee list is stabilizing a bit. For those of you that just joined, welcome. My name's Christy Wake. I'm from the Center for Faculty Excellence, and I'll be facilitating today's paper presentation for you. And our paper presentation is titled Burnout, Vicarious Trauma, and Compassion Fatigue Among Wildfire Fighter Fighters, a Mixed Methods Approach. Now, before I hand things off to the presenters, I would like to just go through a couple Zoom items. You've probably all seen this before if you've been to other sessions early in the day, but I'll run through it quickly one last time for you all. So you do come in the room on mute, but if you need to adjust any of your audio settings in terms of your speakers, you can click on the audio settings button in the lower left corner and adjust your volume or choose which device that audio is coming from. Any of that can be adjusted here. Next, I just want to point out this lower center area of your screen. There's some engagement options that you can utilize during the session today. We do have the chat open, so we encourage you to use that space. Let us know where you're joining in from. Share any comments or questions as our presenters go through their slides today, and then we will have some time designated at the end for questions. Additionally, we have a closed caption space or button rather that you can click on and enable those. We do have a live captionist with us today. And also going back to the chat, when you do type your questions in, I just want to point out that you'll see a drop down where you can select if that question is going to all of the panelists, and that just means it goes to me and the presenters, or you can choose all panelists and attendees, and that allows everyone on the call to see the questions or comments that you're sharing. Last thing I want to call out here is the View Options button or drop down at the top of your screen. If you click on that, you'll be able to adjust the zoom ratio or exit full screen. Sometimes the Zoom window might display larger or smaller than you want it to, and this area is where you can adjust that. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce the presenters for today's session. We have Samantha Costamo. She is a student in the MS Clinical Mental Health Counseling program within the School of Clinical Mental Health Counseling, and she's specializing in addiction counseling and trauma and crisis. And we also have Dr. Rebecca Stout with us. She's a program director for the Masters of Public Administration. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Stout as she's going to kick off the session this afternoon.
Great, next slide. And thank you so much for having us today, Christy, and for everyone for coming to attend to our presentation. Before I get started, I want to let you all know that we are recipients of the FRIG grant, and this is the research project we undertook this past year to answer some questions that have been going around in our state, particularly here in Colorado. So just to introduce our problem, we actually live here in Colorado, and we have experienced some enormous wildfires. And if you've seen the news, you've seen it happening here in California along the western areas of the country. And we had some curiosity about this. What is the impact of all of this? And so we did some background research, and I know that firefighters have been known to experience high levels of occupational stress, and that they know that at least 54% of firefighter deaths are actually attributed to occupational stress, and that includes overexertion, heart attack, stroke, and coronary disease. But keep in mind that those estimates actually be higher because other deaths, such as field accidents, may also be caused by occupational stress. Next slide, please. Samantha, I think we can't hear you.
Yeah, it was just unmuted. Stress manifests in many different forms. Burnout is a psychological syndrome that manifests due to chronic stressors on the job. Initially, it was developed to determine burnout among human service professionals. However, now it's used in multiple fields, including emergency services. Compassion fatigue is a type of stress to the responder that results from helping those have experienced trauma and experience feeling as if they're experiencing the trauma themselves. Compassion fatigue compounds with burnout, and it depletes one's ability to cope with their daily responsibilities. People who suffer from compassion fatigue, they tend to have negative coping mechanisms. Alcohol abuse, reduced empathies towards others are both things that have been noted in their overall job satisfaction. And finally, vicarious trauma. These schematic changes often result in responders becoming pessimistic and cynical as a part of their nature. Vicarious trauma is commonly experienced with paramedics, social workers, medical professionals, police officers, and firefighters.
Next slide, please. So here's the problem. We are experiencing enormous growth in population here in Colorado. The U.S. Census in 2019 reported the population growth of 14.5% since 2010, making Colorado the second fastest growing state in the country. As the population continues to grow, it also is moving into fire-prone areas. This means that the community risk drastically increases. Currently, there are more than 1 million people living in Colorado's high-risk wildfire red zone. In fact, this past summer in 2020, the Pine Gulch Fire near Grand Junction, Colorado on the western slope burned more than 139 acres of land, making it the largest wildfire in Colorado history. The fire surpassed the acreage burned in 2002 of the Hayman Fire, which burned more than 137 acres and destroyed 600 structures, including 133 residences. There's multiple reasons that are being cited for the increase of wildfires and their intensity. Number one is changing climate. We have experienced record droughts, higher levels of temperatures, and we have seen a decrease in snow and ice coverage, wildlife patterns, and habitat changes. What we're seeing now is a notably longer and more severe wildfire season. Each of these climate shifts impact environmental changes, and that impacts the wildfire propensity along with the rapidly growing urban development of Colorado. With the expected wildfire growth in the future and an increase of wildfire team demands, it's really important to understand how these firefighters are experiencing vicarious trauma, burnout, and compassion. Next slide, please.
All right. To date, there are few studies that consider firefighters and the resultant burnout, compassion, fatigue, and vicarious trauma. Although there has never been a Photovoice methodology used to express the personal experiences from inside the career. So we're excited we're able to fill a gap and find photos and find the connection between what firefighters are really experiencing and what that means for their mental health and how we can break that down to help. Next slide, please.
So as Sam noted, there's been a few studies out there that firefighters do experience burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. None of them have examined a possible connection with wildfire response. It's really important to understand and recognize the risk of wildfire response on firefighters' mental health because this will enable states and government programs to develop better programs to meet the needs of firefighters and, by extension, other emergency responders. Next slide, please.
Areas of work-life model is one of the theoretical foundations that we use. This model suggests that the greater work-life imbalance that exists, the greater risk of burnout, and then consequently compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. Next slide.
So our study was built upon 4 specific research questions. We wanted to know, do firefighters who respond to wildfires experience burnout, compassion fatigue, and trauma? And then building off of those questions and the results, we wanted to know, how do photographs actually convey the perspectives of firefighters? Next slide, please.
The Photovoice methodology was used to enable firefighters' own voices and experiences to be added to the research data. This method helps to fill a hole in the existing literature regarding these career firefighter experiences. As always, when it comes to setting up a research design, it didn't exactly go the way that we anticipated. We initially thought that the design was going to be a quantitative plus qualitative study, but due to the gap in time from interviewing our participants and the timeline of this crazy year for everyone, it ended up being a sequential quantitative qualitative study. People indicated a lot of interest, but we just had disruptions. Life happened. Next slide.
It has been an interesting year for sure. Next slide, please. So for our method, we surveyed career firefighters at a large metropolitan fire department here in Colorado. The population of that fire department is 600 career firefighters. There are no volunteer firefighters in this particular department. They are all career firefighters over the age of 21 to 65. The survey was sent through Google Forms through a secured link. The captain of the fire department agreed to partner with us. And after we received IRB approval from Walden University, as a side note, the fire department actually does not have an IRB process or an equivalent. We were able to partner with her, and she sent out the Google link for us. We sent out the email survey, she sent the email survey 3 times, and eventually we ended up with a sample size of 186 participants, which exceeded our calculated G-Power sample size of 176. We asked in that survey for participants who were interested to indicate their name or their email and their cell number. That information was kept separate from their survey results. So there was no correlation between their survey responses and that interest in the secondary portion of our study. We then contacted those individuals. We only heard back from 2 who confirmed participation, and so we ended up using snowball sampling to recruit an additional 5 participants. And we'll go into more details in a few minutes about that process. Next slide, please.
The surveys were administered electronically, as we said, using Google Forms. And the survey took approximately 20 minutes for participants to complete and contained the following sections: the Maslow Burnout Inventory General Study Scale, a 16 Likert scale of questions that measures emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment, the Compassion Fatigue Scale, a 66 Likert style question that measures compassion fatigue. For this one, we did reduce the number of questions down to 28 just for time limitations. Our third scale was the Vicarious Trauma Scale, and 8 Likert style questions that asked participants about their exposure to secondary trauma. Section number 4, demographic variables. The demographic variables are nominal level variables, and they served as independent variables in the quantitative data analysis. The demographic variables for firefighters were the career status, age, race and ethnicity, gender, and length of service. The final section was experience in wildfire response. Next slide, please.
So these were the overall results of the study. And interestingly, for the MBI, it's important to note that instead of an overall score, it actually is among 3 constructs: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. So what we found from our firefighters that the emotional exhaustion, they are experiencing a low and moderate level. Depersonalization is moderate. Depersonalization means that you do not, that those people become objects, that they're not people any longer. Reduced personal accomplishment was low, meaning that firefighters do have great pride in their abilities and in their careers. Compassion fatigue, though, is alarming. It was extremely high, very, very high for this particular sample. And then vicarious trauma was moderate. Next slide, please.
It was determined that there was no statistical significance between the ranks of the firefighters, although an examination of means did identify that both lieutenants and captains experienced the highest levels of burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. It was also determined that there was statistical significance with emotional exhaustion and depersonalization, but not with personal accomplishment, compassion fatigue, or vicarious trauma. Firefighters, there were 2 categories of firefighters between the ages of 35 and 44 and 55 and 64. And these two groups experienced the highest levels of emotional exhaustion and depersonalization. There was also statistical significance of depersonalization for those with 11 to 15 years of experience and 6 to 10 years of experience. Next slide, please.
So what we found were that the firefighters who are mid-career and more in the middle age area are experiencing higher levels of burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. So we know overall that the firefighters are experiencing these psychological maladaptations. So that led us to our next research question. How do photographs convey the perspectives of firefighters? Next slide, please.
So purposive and Stovall sampling was utilized for this study. Participants initially indicated their interest, but we, of course, only ended up with 7 firefighters. We had 3 women and 4 men. The ages ranged from 29 to 50s. All but 1 firefighter currently employed by the fire department. All the firefighters were Caucasian. We recognize that although we were able to gain a research group, that this particular research group is very limiting and restricted to 1 metropolitan area. However, due to the significance of this information and what we can do with it and how we can help our firefighters, we stuck to it and kept along. Next slide, please.
So a little bit about Photovoice. It's an emerging qualitative methodology. It's not really well used yet, but I think it's going to continue to grow. It enables participants to share their experiences through the use of photography. It's typically used in community-based participatory research projects because it enables participants to identify and discuss topics of importance to them. Both, just as a note, both Sam and I attended a 3-day Photovoice training before COVID to make sure that we understood exactly how to use this methodology. This methodology is also used for digital storytelling and participatory photography. In this study, we used digital storytelling and participatory photography because the firefighters act as agents by taking the photos and discussing their importance with us. They were owners of the photos. They controlled the setting, the framing, and the content of each photograph. The interviews were open-ended and controlled by the participants. They chose the order of the photographs, and we just asked probing questions to get the stories behind each photograph. We learned details of the photos, the firefighters' experiences, and the emotions experienced with their careers. The participants led the discussion throughout the interviews. As a note, those interviews lasted anywhere from 58 minutes to over 2 hours. We have quite a bit of data. Next slide, please.
The Photovoice interviews were recording using the iPhone voice memo app and then updated to the NVivo transcription program. The interviews were reviewed and scrubbed for filler words such as and the coding was completed using NVivo and was informed by areas of work life. The software identified themes among each transcript, and then we conducted a secondary coding through the theoretical lens of area of work life. Next slide, please.
So as our study continued to evolve, and the firefighters took ownership of this study, it actually evolved away from wildfire response. While all of the firefighters whom we interviewed had experience with wildland response, only 1 actually included photographs specific to wildland firefighting. Instead, the firefighters actually chose a variety of photographs of importance to them, primarily taken in the metropolitan area. We kept going with the study. So even though the study evolved from what we initially thought it would be, the data and information I think is still incredibly valid and important to the field. From their interviews, we found out that firefighters indicated great pride in their careers, but they quickly identified areas of their jobs that cause stress. And we identified these 2 areas that cause stress as traumatic incidents and sleep and shift work. The secondary themes that emerged were actually ways to cope with the stresses or to mitigate those. And they were mentoring and support and then exercise and balance or wellness. Next slide, please.
Some of the traumatic events that the firefighters included were wildfires, COVID, house fires, children drowning, school shootings. 9/11 was often mentioned, and similarly, the loss of a colleague, and harassment was one of the items on the list as traumatic events. Next slide, please.
So we'll go through these photographs because they're so interesting to see. So participant 1 was the first participant we were actually able to interview in person. The remainder interviews had to be done over the phone due to COVID limitations. But this was done before, so we lucked out having that conversation with them. He noted about his diversity of his career, ranging from the Columbine High School shooting to the Highlands Ranch STEM school shooting, and then also on how many car accidents. So this first photograph actually is a car accident. He had a great deal of remorse about this car accident. Interestingly, this car accident actually was the result of a man who was responding to a call that the fire department had sent to him to respond to an alarm going off in his office building. And this was early hours of the morning, and he was hit head on in a highway here in the metropolitan area, and it was a fatality. And as the participant said, he said, you can see the impact. This poor gentleman, he was doing nothing other than driving around for somebody going to a fire alarm that we called out to him, and she came across the median and hit him head on. Participant 2 actually, along with other participants, made reference to the passing of an assistant chief of this fire department. He passed away due to job-related cancer. And this was a very powerful moment for her. She wanted to make sure we understood a number of fire trucks who appeared to show honor to this passing of her colleague. Participant 3, this is an amazing interview here. We actually look at, this is a hoarding situation. They were called out for a medical call, and he said this was a moment where you see the worst of people that they never intended for you to see. And he made note here in the middle of the photograph of participant 3, that is actually dog feces. And he said that was all over the house. This is someone's living room. And he said you would never know from the people on the outside of their house what the inside is like, and that he deals with this on a daily basis. Participant 4, along with other participants, made note of the 9/11 incidents. And then participant 5 also made note to school shootings. And you can see here, this was at the STEM school shooting that participant 1 also made reference to, and how he felt the loss of power with the school shootings and the loss of life for children. Next slide, please.
Participant 5 also made reference to the traumatic events that he saw in his career. He started with a picture of a car accident that was a diesel fuel truck that had was engulfed in flames. They also got a call while they were responding to the fire that there was a potential shooter on the highway. Unfortunately, there was no communication, and so when the police received the call that there was an active shooter, they didn't realize that it was actually a case of extra bad road rage and had nothing to do with the firefighters. However, participant 5 used this as an example to some of the stress and unexpected things that happened. Here they are with a fuel tanker, and if you can look, and I'm not sure if you all can see, but the pavement looks wet. It almost looks like there are waves across the top of the pavement, and that's the fuel leaking down the highway. So he used this as an example that they were dealing with an engulfed truck on the highway. It was potentially explosive, very explosive, and also a call of an active shooter to protect themselves. So this was all at the same time. Participant 5 also shared a photograph of a pair of child's shoes. He discussed how this was one of the Make-A-Wish Foundation fulfillments for a terminally ill child that wanted to ride on the fire truck. Unfortunately, the situation wasn't what it seemed. Last year, we discovered that actually she did not have a terminal illness, but that her mom was charged with first-degree murder for poisoning Munchausen by proxy. The world's a cruel place, he said. This was a photo that I used to really enjoy looking at, and now I look at it and it's sort of lost all value to me. That was a really powerful interview that he talked about, and he took some time to step away from that photograph. Participant 6 was reflective of serious injury he had experienced during a call. He shared a picture of himself at the hospital. He was burned responding to a house fire and said, "I'll be honest with you, I never thought I would get burned as a firefighter because in the academy, they just spent so much time on practicing putting on your gear. It was a humbling experience. Certainly, I gained a lot from that." Participant Number 7 was more reflective on the COVID environment and how the job has changed with the 2020 pandemic. Right now, she says, everything that you've known to be true has turned on its head. With wearing all the regalia, you know, I'm a big hand holder. I like looking into people's eyes. I like talking to them and feeling close. And so all of a sudden, to sort of feel separated through so much creepiness, and you can't see patients' facial expressions when they're wearing a mask. They can't see yours. You can see the fear in the public when you show up. You know, a lot of people are afraid, as they should be. It's a scary freaking disease process. Participant 7 sees her role as a support for the community and has struggled with changes due to COVID. She expressed frustration with the lack of gear and the amount of time that it takes her to disinfect her gear and personal protective equipment. She also saw COVID as a new era in history and tried to maintain perspective of how the pandemic was affecting her career. She remembers, I think I've really had to readjust my expectations. I think Roosevelt said it best. Comparison is the thief of joy. Participant 7 was the only firefighter to provide a photo of a wildfire also. Next slide, please.
So the second contributor to stress that the firefighters identified was the sleep and shift work. We did find that, just a little background, we know that these firefighters work 48, 96-hour shifts. That's 2 days on, 4 days off. And they talked about the lack of sleep on duty and then how they spend their days off trying to catch up on sleep. And a term that kept emerging through the interviews was this term of hypervigilance. Next slide, please. Some photographs taken at night.
All participants but participant 1 and 2 made a reference to sleep and how it impacted their lives. Participant 3 confessed that he's actively seeking help and that he recognizes that it's part of a problem in the profession and is a scary aspect. He said, we need firefighters and emergency responders in general to be hypervigilant. And so we struggle to sleep and we don't eat as well. We all have these comorbidities because of that. Participant 4 described her job as a floater. Instead of being assigned to one particular firehouse, she was assigned to stations that needed her for the day or the night or a shorter period of time. She mentioned how the lack of a home station impacted her ability to sleep and that the lack of sleep led to unhealthy coping behaviors. Participant 4's sleep struggle has continued after her retirement from the fire service. She has shared that she uses Ambien and abuses alcohol. And she's shared with us that she still has dreams about work. I have dreams, she says. I have nightmares about where I have dreams about work. Participant 5 is currently in a role where he's no longer assigned a 48-hour, 96-hour shift, so his perspective is unique. But he did reflect, and he said that the 48-hour shifts were terrible. Most of us had a hard time sleeping, even on a night when sirens don't go off, because there's that underlying anxiety, preparing for the unknown. He also noted the struggles with alcohol dependency. Participant 6 continued and discussed sleep as an issue, especially as a result of shift work. He did acknowledge that the fire department is working to make changes on this schedule, and that the chiefs are recognizing that this is dangerous and putting their employees' lives at risk. And finally, participant 7 also made a note of hypervigilance in firefighters and how it impacts sleep. He said, I think a big part of burnout in this job is finding a way to keep your foot off the throttle. It's fun to have your foot on the throttle, and that's exciting. But if you're in that chronic state of hypervigilance too much, too often, it jacks up your sleep. Like for me, that's a huge thing. Next slide.
So interestingly, we also, through the interviews, the firefighters all identified positive ways of coping with those stresses. And the themes that we identified were peer mentors, dogs, exercise, and balance or wellness. Next slide, please.
So the first common theme was mentoring. All 7 of the firefighters really emphasized the importance of peer mentoring to help them manage stress and to learn coping skills on the job. Participant 1, a battalion chief, took his role as a mentor seriously and remembered when he had his own that it was a skill that he wanted to learn. Participant 2 explained that the mentoring she received from her chief has taught her the value of balance and work life. She said, I go off of kind of a formula so that I have energy for other people. I wake up happy. You know, almost every day I feel good. Our chief sees great significance in taking time for ourselves. She also saw herself as a role model to children in the community. She mentioned, I believe my first foremost role is to present that the female gender can be doing this, can be firefighting. Participant 3 serves as a peer mentor for the fire department and recognizes that his own role is instrumental in others' success. He stated, I think when you're a mentor and if you're putting your mind to it, that requires a lot of self-reflection, examination of your part and your principles. And what do you think it is important? How do you reflect on how you do things? It helps to grow. Just from a kind of legacy standpoint, it feels good to give back and it feels good to be able to offer our support to teams. I think it's a good thing. Participant 4 also mentioned mentoring in her career, but explained that that was a factor that eventually led to leave the field. She did not have that experience. Participant 5 also talked about mentoring in his career, and it was a big part of him choosing this particular field. And participant 6 remembered one particular call at the beginning of his career. And he said, I remember there was a call a few years ago. A bunch of teenagers fell through the ice. And then the department was forcing everyone to go to these peer support meetings. I don't think it's beneficial to be forced to go to a meeting. Or maybe you don't feel comfortable talking about things or listening to things or revisiting that situation. So I think it's like when participant 3 called me about a drowning patient. That led to a lot of help because I respected him, I knew him, and I knew he was genuine. The primary point of his picture here was that how much he appreciated the mentor relationship instead of a setting where there are meetings. And finally, particularly when firefighters are new to the job, having a mentor is incredibly impactful and makes all the difference in the world. And some of the people that I've come across in my career, a lot of hard asses, a lot of really good people. Next slide.
So dogs also emerged, and this is a really interesting aspect of our study. Almost every person mentioned dogs. Participant 2 shared her sister's dog, whom she had to take to work, but it really led to a conversation about how the fire department is using therapy dogs as a part of their way of helping firefighters cope with stress. Participant 3 took a picture of his own dog, and he talked about how he takes his dog hunting, and he just loves dogs. And his quote, I love his quote, the guys love it. It's just a different thing. It adds an element of diffusing and changing the nature of the firehouse, and we have a dog. Participant 4, who is retired from the fire service, she loves dogs. She said, I'm a huge dog person. They've been so critical in my life. I love dogs a lot more than I love humans. And participant 7 also talked about the therapy dog situation. She said they don't talk and they don't judge you. They just allow you to touch them. They want you to touch them. It's a physical contact that's really calming. Next slide, please.
All right. All of the participants took pride in their physical fitness and the amount of time and effort that they put into taking care of their bodies. Participant 1 mentioned the department's wellness program was a precursor to the mental wellness, the department's wellness program was a precursor to the mental wellness program that the department has since developed. Participant 2 emphasized the role of exercise in maintaining a healthy work-life balance. She reflected on her time as ski patrol and her love of the outdoors. She said, I go in the back country and I ski or I run, and you know, my favorite place is sitting on top of a mountain. And you go up there and you are on the top of a mountain. Nobody wants anything from you. You know, there are no demands. Participant 3 shared a picture of his home gym that featured his weight set and how he has fostered a lifelong practice of exercise. Participant 4 mentions exercise in her career, but as a way to be equal with her male counterparts. Her example was unique in that she personally struggled with being the only woman in her cohort and took pride that she graduated first in her class. I always had to be better than everyone, she said. So, you know, I like to prove myself that much more because they do. We have to pass the same tests. I worked my ass off my whole career. I did graduate. That's pretty exciting, and I'm pretty proud of this. I graduated first in my academy out of 13 guys. I was the only girl. On the other hand, participant 5 did not expressly discuss exercise, but he did allude to the adrenaline rush that many of the firefighters crave. And participant 6 began his interview with the discussion loving biking. And then he told us an amazing story about how he spent the summer and he biked all the way from San Francisco to New York City, and he stayed at a different firehouse every night. And he was able to raise money for the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation, which is a nonprofit on the East Coast. And he landed in New York City on 9/11 in 2014. Lastly, participant 7 also noted the desire to work in a career that allowed her to be physical and in shape. She saw balance in her life as critical. She's an open lesbian woman who recently married. One photograph she shared was a bike she drove in the Pride Parade. She reflected on the importance of maintaining a healthy work-life balance and said, I think the point of having a poor work-life balance, and I think that when your family feels like they're playing second fiddle all the time to the department, it's really hard. Next slide.
So I know we're almost out of time, so we'll talk quickly through the discussion. So we found that our firefighters are experiencing burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma, but there was no statistical difference between wildfire responders and non-wildfire responders. Our hunch is, though, that there is some difference, and that this difference is probably for people who are more out on the rural areas of states. And it would be good to do more research with those particular groups who are experiencing these intense wildfires throughout the country and how they are handling these high levels of trauma and stress. We also found that mid-career responders were more likely to experience these psychological aspects, and it really probably reflects the life-work balance that came from our theoretical framework, and that at those ages we are all handling families and spouses and all these different stressors, but older people have experienced empty nest portion of their lives, and younger firefighters are without those extra stresses. We did find alcoholism and divorce to be common themes that also emerged from our interviews. As for the Photovoice interviews, which were so interesting, we did find that there were 2 major themes contributing to stress and 2 coping mechanisms. Interestingly, in terms of the research, a lot of our work actually contradicted some of the existing literature. We found that most of the research on stress and sleep has been quantitative in nature, where people are actually measured the amount of sleep they get and their adrenaline responses. There's not a lot of qualitative work out there. And so these stories need to be told. How are firefighters experiencing these traumatic incidences and the incidences with sleep? The 2 coping mechanisms were very interesting. There's very little research on the effects of mentoring, very, very little on dogs. And as for exercise, the existing literature says that exercise for firefighters has the opposite effect, that firefighters find that there's an obligation, but yet every single one of our firefighters took pride in their exercise and they loved it. So there's a lot more to be done out there. We're very excited for that. So the next slide, please. So as we think, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sam.
Oh, I was going to say, as wildfires continue to grow in strength and devastation, firefighters are continuously asked to do more with less budget, less personnel, added stress, physical strain. All of these things only add more suffering to an already stressful, demanding job. It's our goal to continue developing this essential research so that our firefighters and first responders have the mental health support and resources they need to protect our communities, enjoy their careers, and to stay safe.
All right, thank you so much for attending today. Are there any questions?
This is Christy. I'll just remind you that you can ask questions or share any comments in the chat area if you'd like to. We are right at the end of time, so we might have time for a question or a comment to share if anyone has any. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just let you know that this session has been recorded, and I am told that the PowerPoints and the recordings and any supplemental resources from any of the sessions today will be made available in ScholarWorks. So you'll have access to that if you want to revisit any of this. This is the last time slot of paper presentations for the research conference. So I hope you guys enjoyed the day and were able to participate in multiple different sessions. Seeing some thank yous in the chat area to our presenters. Great presentation. I got caught up in your Photovoice stories. I agree. Those were really engaging and interesting to see the data that way. Here's one question. Are you planning to expand your research to include firefighters of other ethnic groups?
Yes, please.
The answer is yes, absolutely. The metropolitan area fire department that we surveyed and did our study in is primarily white. That is pretty reflective of that particular part of the city. I think there's a story to be told for the other ethnic groups to think about how they deal with serving different communities. There was a story one of our firefighters talked about how he responded to primarily minority communities when he was sent out to help with another group, and how that experience itself was different. So I think there's stories to be told. And in our research that we found, Dr. Ramey, we did not see anything that focused on those ethnic responses. So I think there's a whole area out there to be explored. Great question. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you both for presenting and sharing the information and the research that you worked so hard to gather. Really interesting stuff, and thank you for being a part of the research conference, our very first virtual research conference. So, and thanks to all of you on the line that were able to attend today's session and the conference itself. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.